Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for sexualities and social issues. Today we're going to start talking about bodies, and specifically we're going to start talking about ways that bodies can be sexy. We'll talk about different body types and shapes and sizes, and what we find sexy and what we don't. So our first question is what it means to sexualize a body. So basically, we all have bodies. We're all walking around in bodies all day, every day, but we're not always using those bodies for sex or thinking about those bodies in a sexual way. So what I mean when I say we're sexualizing bodies is essentially that we're taking any standard body and thinking about it in sexual ways. Sometimes this is appropriate. Sometimes this is what we do with our own sexual partners. But sometimes this is not appropriate, and it's something that socially we don't accept. So what we're going to do today is start to talk about why we sexualize bodies, and today we'll focus on female bodies. Next week we'll focus on male bodies and other types. So let's start with an example. If you look at this picture, you can see that on the top here we have a beautiful example of the sexualization of female bodies. These women are actresses, but you can't tell from this picture. They could be any kind of woman. Basically, the point here is that they're naked for no reason. The picture on the bottom, on the other hand, is clearly mocking the top bottom. They're using male bodies, and they're kind of making a joke about whether you can even sexualize male bodies, especially male bodies that might be larger than the stereotype of what we're used to for male actors. So the very fact that they would joke around about sexualizing a male body, especially for instance Seth Rogen's male body or Jonah Hill's male body, indicates that that is somehow funny, which indicates that it's somehow unusual. So basically, when we talk about sexualizing bodies, very often it's only specific bodies that we do this to, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. So one of the first things to talk about when we think about the sexualization of bodies is the way that it's a social process. So for instance, you could argue that bodies have both biological and social functions. Most parts of our bodies have both of those functions. So for instance, if you were looking at a female body, you might biologically talk about childbirthing hips. Or if you were looking at a male body, you might biologically talk about having strong arms. However, if you're talking about the social aspects of this, you'll notice that we think about those same body parts totally differently. What does it mean if you're having sex with someone who has unusually wide hips? Or what does it mean if you can see a man's forearms where previously you couldn't see them? So basically, all parts of our body have a biological function, but the social function is what we're going to talk about today, and the ways that we do tend to consider it really differently. So one of the first questions to consider is which bodies are sexually available? Because they aren't all. We don't sexualize every single body. Typically, we have some standards that they have to reach. So for instance, almost everyone agrees that we should not sexualize children. The sexualization of children is a real problem. Sex trafficking children is a real problem. And that's something that everyone can agree on, which is one reason that it's a useful entry to, for instance, conspiracy theories or internet cults. But we also know that we sort of draw a line in the sand, at which point someone stops being a child and starts being an adult. For instance, the internet really did have countdown clocks for Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen for when they turned 18, which is super creepy. Another example might be the way that we tend to not sexualize nuns. People who are religious in nature, especially people who lead church services and that sort of thing, are typically considered out of bounds. So the very fact that we understand that priests and nuns are not supposed to be sexy lends itself well to sexy Halloween costumes. So again, that's an example of sort of sexualizing something that isn't supposed to be sexualized, but for whatever reason, we're often okay with that. Another thing worth considering is that we don't think of all bodies as sexually desirable. Typically, in society, we have some things that we just don't find attractive. And sometimes those are health-related. We typically don't find people who are unhealthy sexually attractive, if they're deeply underweight or overweight, if they have obvious skin conditions or something like that. But we also tend to change our minds about that sort of thing culturally and as we age. So for instance, both of these memes suggest that there are people who are sexually unattractive. In the first one, the guy is saying that he has high standards, yet he hooks up with girls who are, quote, fat and ugly. Which girls are too fat? Which girls are too ugly? That's a question for the individual, and yet also a question for society. Similarly, in the second meme, it's arguing that basically your sugar daddy is good for some things, but you might not want to actually have sex with them, likely because they are old. So essentially, there are some bodies that we find acceptable to be desiring, and there are some bodies that we do not. It gets weird, it's culturally sensitive, and we're going to talk about it now. So we start with the female body, in part because female bodies are often sexualized, regardless of how the person inside the body feels about that. So one of our first questions is what body shape we prefer. Human bodies come in all sorts of shapes, and there are a lot of things you can do to modify or adjust the shape of your body. But which body shape we prefer is both personal and social. We tend to, as a society, and American society specifically, go through phases about which kind of bodies we find sexy, which kind of bodies we find pretty. So you might notice that no matter which body type you have, it may or may not be in fashion. However, that might not matter. When we do studies, including this very unscientific study where they ask people on the street, it turns out that individual people have individual preferences. So even though certain body shapes sort of go in and out of style, personal preference does have a lot to do with it. One of the important things to consider when thinking about what we prefer in women's shape and size is race and ethnicity. So even though white culture tends to change based on what we like over the decades, other cultures can be a little bit more consistent. And it is important to remember that different cultures celebrate different things. So for instance, Nicki Minaj has made a whole career out of having a great big butt. Other women, for instance, in Latin cultures are celebrated for their curves. So depending on what kind of culture you're in, it might be valuable to be skinny, but it really might not. This also tends to vary with class. For instance, in some cultures, and especially over the course of history, being a little bit fat meant that you were wealthy. So it was considered a sign of honor to have a fat wife, or to have a double chin, or to have a little tummy. But in other cultures, including white American culture right now, it's considered valuable to be thin, because it means you have enough excess income to choose what you eat and to choose to spend a lot of time exercising. So your class might have a lot to do with what we think your body shape should be. Another factor, of course, is time. Our ideal body shape for women does change, and it does tend to go in cycles, which is also interesting. So for instance, in this picture, you'll notice that for a while we really valued that sort of hourglass shape that Marilyn Monroe epitomized. Then, in the 90s, we were into that sort of heroin chic, super skinny shape that Kate Moss epitomized. And now, in the 2010s, you could argue that we were really into this sort of extreme hourglass shape that Kim Kardashian epitomized. So over the course of time, what we think women should look like does tend to change with our cultural standards, including how wealthy the culture is, or what kind of food is in style, or whatever else might be going on. The final factor worth considering is how early we begin the sexualization of women. And it may not surprise you to learn that we begin it very early, much too early. It's a problem. Sometimes we think that someone is being sexualized when perhaps they aren't, such as this girl in the middle who's wearing a bikini, but that doesn't mean there's anything sexual about it. But sometimes we argue that it isn't sexual when maybe it is, like the girls on Toddlers and Tiaras, who are wearing fake hair and nails and tans and sparkles. Sometimes we find that girls get sexualized before they're ready for it anyway. Girls getting catcalled can start as early as 10, but most women have been catcalled at some point in their life, and it was probably before they were ready to start thinking about that sort of thing. So the sexualization of women's bodies is intense, and it starts young, and it continues almost until you die. So one of the things that we're going to start to talk about now are the ways that we sexualize different body parts, because we don't consider every part of the body equally. So let's begin with breasts. Now breasts, of course, have a huge variety of ways that they can look and sizes that they can be, but that doesn't stop us from having certain ideals about how big we think they should be and what they should be used for. So if we think, for instance, about the biological versus the social function of breasts, we understand pretty clearly what the biological function is. It's feeding babies. But what is the social function of breasts? They don't really do anything, they mostly just sit there, and yet they can be very powerful. Men, for instance, can find them very distracting. But how the social function of breasts can play out, depending on the women, is a really unique social thing. So first, let's think about the presence of breasts in advertising. So in these pictures, you can see people's boobs being used to great advantage. For instance, in this ad on the left, we're looking at a woman who's arguing that she can't cook, but who cares? So this is a really interesting question. Why does it matter that she can't cook? Is she applying for a job as a cook? And the answer, of course, which we all culturally understand, is no, she's not. What she's saying is that she doesn't have value as a woman who cooks, but she does have value as a woman who looks good. This is a bizarre reductionist argument, right? She's basically saying that she does have value as a mate solely because her boobs are so great that it won't matter if you're malnourished. Or what about this Campari ad? This is an amazing ad because no one has a head or a face, and yet mysteriously there are no less than 4 right hands. It might have been unclear to you what this ad is for. It primarily features breasts and maybe an ice cube, so it might surprise you to learn that it's an ad for alcohol. But using breast right in the middle as prominently as possible is an ages-old tradition in terms of selling products that have nothing to do with breasts at all. Next, let's look at an ad for a Keira Knightley movie. So this is a great example of the way that breasts are so important that we're willing to artificially augment them. So on the left, you can see the final poster. The picture in the middle is what her breasts really look like. She is rather famously flat-chested. This doesn't impact her work as an actor. Again, breasts don't really have much to do with that. But it does impact the way that the people who were producing the movie thought it would sell. So clearly, they enhanced her breast a lot for the poster. She came out against this, saying that she thought it was kind of weird and fake, but it's a great example of the ways that we think that if breasts are bigger, somehow the product itself is improved. One interesting thing about the way that we think of the size and shape of breasts in America is that we have a sort of ideal, and often we call this the Goldilocks dilemma. So you probably remember the story of Goldilocks. She didn't like things that were too big, and she didn't like things that were too small. She liked things that were just right. And we're kind of the same way with breast size. So basically there are a lot of different kinds of surgeries you can get to change the size and shape of your breasts, but we tend to stick to 2, and that's enlarging them and reducing them. So in America, it's much more popular to enlarge them. Last year, about 300,000 people had their breast augmented to make them larger. Breast reduction, on the other hand, is less popular. Last year, about 44,000 people had their breast reduced to make them smaller. One thing you'll notice, though, if you look at these pictures, is that the final results are pretty similar, which sort of indicates that we do have an ideal of what size and shape we think breasts should be. It's also worth considering that breast implants are a much more minor surgery than breast reduction is. So it's actually cheaper and safer and easier to make your breasts bigger than it is to make them smaller. That might have something to do with what we value in America, but it does also have something to do with how difficult the surgery can be. So we know that a lot of women are doing this, which means that they must be convinced that their breasts are either too big or too small, which is another part of the body shaming issue that we talked about earlier. Another weird thing about breasts is that we often don't talk about them unless we're talking about them having cancer. So this is kind of a strange thing, right? We almost never talk openly about breasts in public unless maybe there's something wrong with them. So breast cancer is not uncommon. Maybe 1 in 8 women get some form of breast cancer over the course of their lives. And in fact, about 1 in 1,000 men do too, because men do have breast tissue. So you've probably seen a lot of marches or walks about breast cancer. You've probably seen pink products everywhere. And it's great that we're acknowledging this as a women's health problem, but it is kind of weird that this is almost the only time that we talk openly about breasts in public. I also want to take a moment to say that the Komen Foundation is not great. They kind of stole the pink ribbon itself from another foundation, and a lot of the money that they raise goes to them and not to research at all. So if you're interested in donating to breast cancer research, maybe skip the Komen Foundation because they don't always use that money the way that they said they were going to. The final thing worth talking about breasts is their actual biological function, which is, of course, breastfeeding. So breastfeeding is completely normal and healthy. It's good for moms, good for babies. Most people were breastfed when they were babies, but for some reason we're still very uncomfortable with it. We do not like it when women breastfeed in public. We do not like it when they breastfeed on TV. If they breastfeed, we want them to cover up with some sort of dramatic cape. So it's another really interesting example of the way that we're fine with looking at breasts in almost every advertisement. We're fine with commercials for Victoria's Secret runway shows, but we don't want women to use their breasts for their biological purpose in public. It's just another weird thing about America. So next, let's talk about butts and hips. So the way that we think about butts and hips, and specifically how big they should be, has undergone a dramatic change in American culture in the last decade or so. And this is at least partially due to the fact that we're starting to appreciate the sexuality of women who aren't white. So ethnicity has a lot to do with how big we think somebody's hips and butt should be. For instance, in black culture, it has long been valued to have shapely butts and hips. But in American white culture, it was not. So the fact that we're beginning to appreciate the sexuality of women who aren't white could be considered a good thing, because it does make a lot more room for women with different body shapes to be appreciated. But it could also be an aspect of cultural appropriation. This is something I'm interested in talking about. So one of the things that we've noticed is that depending on what ethnicity you are, you probably have an idea of what your butt should look like. For instance, again, in white culture, we're used to butts being pretty flat. In Hispanic culture, on the other hand, we're used to butts being pretty round. In black culture, as previously mentioned, the value of a big butt is high. So high that you might be willing to buy products that actually make it look bigger. Whereas in white American culture, you might buy products that make it look smaller. So basically, how we feel about butts and hips has a lot to do with ethnicity. We have also recently started to experiment with change. So there are a series of different kinds of surgeries you can get in regard to augmenting the shape of your butt. So for instance, if we look at these, you'll see that people have done about 25,000 butt augmentations in the last year. It's pretty common to take fat from a part of your body where you don't want it and put it where you do want it, which is bizarre and sort of sci-fi, but like, alright. So the very rise of butt augmentation surgeries indicates a rise in our appreciation of large and shapely butts. That said, butts are attached to thighs. So one of the things that we're seeing lately is this sort of dispute about, again, how big thighs should be. For a long time, especially in white American culture, thin thighs were considered very valuable. You've probably heard people talk about thigh gap and about how tight your jeans should be, and that's an interesting example of how we valued a certain level of skinniness. On the other hand, we're starting to see a rise in the popularity of thick thighs. You may have seen buttons like this that say "thick thighs save lives." And that's kind of an interesting cultural turn, that we went from valuing one thing to valuing almost its opposite. This might have something to do with how big we like our butts to be. Typically, if you want a big butt, you're going to need big thighs to support it. One thing that I think is interesting about this is that we have seen this sort of shift towards a valuing of larger thighs reflected in different things like cartoons. So in this cartoon right here, you can see this woman sort of characterizing her own journey. So she notes that 5 years ago, she was upset that her thighs looked big when she sat down, and now she appreciates how they look and smells thick with 2 C's. So again, cultural standards do change. So next, let's talk about uteri. Or uteruses. Technically both are correct. I just think it's harder to say uteruses, so I like uteri, but you can pick which one you like better. So often our first concern with the uterus is periods. In a lot of cultures, menstruation is seen as unclean, and women are sort of sent away to go do this privately. In American culture, we're expected to sort of roll with it and continue doing our lives and work, but it is still often seen as something that is unclean, that we're not supposed to talk about. Part of this might be because of PMS. A lot of women get really grumpy right before they get their periods, in part because of the pain and the hormones, but what it means is that often their pain is not taken seriously. As we've talked about, there's a long history of women's medical health not being either researched or taken seriously, and this is part of that. For a long time, PMS was considered a myth. These days, we understand that it's real because we're able to track hormones, but it can still be a problem for people who are experiencing this in a social way. For instance, getting your period for the first time is in some cultures considered a kind of sexual awakening. In some cultures, that's when you're first considered a woman because you're finally able to bear children. In other cultures, it's considered a shameful secret. So depending on what kind of culture that you were raised in, the time when you got your first period might have been a celebration, or it might have been a horrible negative thing that you didn't want to tell anyone about. So the average American gets their period at about 12 now, which is actually a little bit earlier than women used to historically. And we think that in part this is because we're so well fed, but it might also be because we get so many hormones from the other animals that we eat. So it is kind of a tricky issue. So, one of the things that happens with the uterus and the periods is your monthly cycle. So your monthly cycle can have a lot to do with how you're considered sexually. For instance, if you think about it in terms of a circle, like this picture on the left, there's only really about half of it, maybe a third, when you might be considered fertile. The other parts, you would be considered infertile or actively menstruating. So your sexuality might have to do with whether or not you are fertile at the time. For instance, we've noticed that women are considered more attractive on the days that they're ovulating. And the studies on this are fascinating, because basically the men don't know in the sense that they're not told that the women are ovulating. But essentially, if you're shown a series of pictures of the same woman, you will typically pick the picture of her ovulating even if you don't know that it's different from the others. And interestingly, this is true of both men and women. So it's possible that while you are ovulating, you look more attractive and you feel more interested in sex. We've seen that women tend to prefer different kinds of partners when they're ovulating than when they don't. One of the ways they test this is visually, and another way they test this is with scent. They'll have men run on a treadmill for a while and get a t-shirt nice and sweaty, and then they'll have women smell the t-shirt. And what they smell that's good depends on where they are in their monthly cycle. Fascinating. Another thing that's interesting about sexuality and periods has to do with whether we think you should have sex on your period or not. For a lot of women, they just don't want to. They're in pain, they would like to curl up on the couch. But for a lot of men, they find this very frustrating, because it means that perhaps 1 week out of every month, your girlfriend is unavailable. So the idea that maybe you shouldn't have sex on your period has a lot to do with us considering periods to be unclean. Because you can safely have sex on your period, it's really no problem. But since we're told so often that bodily fluids are bad, and women's bodily fluids especially are bad, people tend to think that when you have your period, you cannot be on your period and sexy at the same time. So this is another sort of interesting social phenomenon about how we think about women's monthly cycles. Another thing that uteruses can do is pregnancy. Sometimes we kind of separate the sex act and pregnancy. We tend to forget that sex can lead to babies because very often the kind of sex that we're having is not procreative in nature. So sometimes the link between sex and pregnancy can sort of get erased. And then we have to ask ourselves, is having sex to get pregnant sexy? Is having sex with the possibility of getting pregnant not sexy? And what about if, via sex or other ways, you do get pregnant? Is the pregnant body a sexual thing? And that is also very dependent on where and when you are. These days, we do allow women to be sort of sexual and pregnant at the same time, but historically that has not been a popular option. In some cultures, the instant that you start to show, you have to sort of go into hiding, and you can't come back out until after you've had that baby. But in other cultures, especially our culture right now, we tend to celebrate the female pregnant form. So for instance, you might not remember this magazine cover of Demi Moore, but it was a big deal at the time, because nobody had been both naked and pregnant on a magazine cover yet. Other people have since done basically the exact same thing, but it was different at the time. Or what about having sex while pregnant? Again, for a long time, that was not considered something that we should do, but these days, it's considered a healthy part of your relationship. So the idea of whether or not you are sexy while you are pregnant is a whole different sort of cultural thing, and we are starting to see a shift in that. The final thing that uteri do is menopause. So menopause is technically the end of your fertility. It's when you stop ovulating, it's when you stop having your monthly periods. But whether or not menopause is also the end of sexuality is an interesting social question. In some cultures, when you stopped being fertile, you stopped being sexy, in large part because you stopped being of any use. If you were only having sex to have children, it was no longer worth having sex with you. In other cultures, when you stopped menstruating, you became more valuable to the tribe as a whole or to your people as a whole, because you were no longer distracted by the duties of childbearing, and so you could begin to focus on more important, higher-level issues. So in some cultures, to be a crone, for instance, is a very respected position, and in some cultures, to be a crone is an insult. In American culture, we kind of go back and forth. We don't really like older ladies very much, but how old you are before you stop being sexy does continue to get pushed back every year. So menopause is not the end of your sexuality, it's just another part. Next, let's talk about vulvas. So, much like breasts, vulvas come in an immense variety of shapes and sizes and colors. Your labia can be long or short or symmetrical, but we're still sometimes concerned about what ours looks like because we almost never see anyone else's. It's the strangest thing. So first, let's think about what might make a vulva good or beautiful or sexy. And again, this can have a lot of variation depending on culture. For instance, what about pubic hair? We tend to go through phases. Do we want a lot of it? A little bit? Should it be in a shape? How long should it be? Or sometimes we think about vulvas as beautiful. What makes the vulva beautiful tends to be personal, but basically we do have concerns about what vulvas look like, even though the appearance has basically nothing to do with their function. One result of our recent concern with the beauty of our vulvas has been concern about what our labia look like. So basically, it doesn't matter what your labia look like. It has almost no impact on your sexuality or your sexual function. There have been cases where women have had really unusually long labia, and it sort of interfered with walking or with sex, but the vast majority of women have perfectly fine labia. But that hasn't stopped the porn industry or the plastic surgery industry from telling them that there's something wrong with them, and then charging them money to fix it. So even though labiaplasty is a kind of a new kind of procedure, it has become relatively popular. In 2018, for instance, more than 10,000 of them were done. So it's a great example of the ways that something that we used to not be concerned with at all has recently become something that we are concerned with. Another example of this would be our recent concern with vaginal tightness. So how tight or loose your vagina is has nothing to do with who you have slept with or what they looked like, and that's the kind of myth that men perpetuate because they're concerned with penis size. But the tightness of your vaginal canal can have to do with childbirth, and it can have to do with the muscles that actually surround your vaginal canal. So for instance, if you're worried about the tightness of your vagina, you could do Kegel exercises, which is when you clench and release your pelvic floor muscles. But generally speaking, you don't need to be concerned about this unless you have recently given birth or unless you're experiencing urinary incontinence. So you could do Kegels if you're worried about it, but generally speaking, you don't really have much to be concerned about. One of the things that has come out of our recent concern with vaginal tightness is a surgery called vaginal rejuvenation. And this is one of the things that makes me really mad, because this is just utter bullshit. It's not a thing. Basically, there's almost no way that your vagina is too loose, and this drawing makes it look like some sort of cavernous opening, which is medically inaccurate and also, I would argue, kind of hurtful. So a lot of women have fallen for this because one of the things that we know about the plastic surgery industry is that it tells you that you're not good enough. And if you're constantly hearing from that industry that you're not good enough, or perhaps from your male partners that you're not good enough, you may be convinced that you need a totally bullshit plastic surgeon to come and fix a part of your body that is already fine. So our concern with vaginal tightness is really generally a concern with penis size, and that's a great example of the ways that the sexualization of the female body do tend to stem from other things that are not the female body. Another thing that vulvas can do is orgasm. So this is another really interesting social phenomenon, because women from the beginning of time have been able to orgasm, especially through stimulation of the clitoris. But in the late 1800s, basically men found out that women could do this, especially white men who were scientists, and they claimed to have invented or discovered the female orgasm. So basically Freud and his ilk decided that what was going on was that a lot of women of their time were experiencing hysteria. And what that meant technically was that their uterus had come loose and was just wandering around in their body. But the way that they cured hysteria was through manual manipulation, which was basically stimulating women into orgasming. The women had an orgasm, they suddenly felt much better, they left the office, everyone was happy. So the sort of original American version of female hysteria and female orgasms had a lot to do with men feeling like they needed to control it because they wanted to control women's health. So that kind of put a damper on things, if you will. Basically, women became worried that if they orgasmed too much, it was problematic. But then they became worried that if they didn't orgasm enough, it was also problematic. So basically the way that we think about the female orgasm does tend to change hugely with what our other social values are at the time. So for instance, how important is it? Is the woman supposed to orgasm too? Is she supposed to orgasm every time? Is she supposed to orgasm more than once? What about the frequency? Is it supposed to happen immediately? Is it supposed to happen all the time? What about the difficulty level? Very often, people talk about getting a woman to orgasm as being an accomplishment. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't view it as something worth doing, but it isn't necessarily an accomplishment in the way that we sort of act like it might be. Part of this has to do with the lack of sex education, including where the clitoris is. But a lot of this has to do with a sort of impatience, especially among really young men, to figure out how to do something like this and how to please their female partner. Because there is always the question of whether women deserve pleasure. And in some cultures, we think that women do. And in some cultures, we think that women don't. For instance, in some cultures, there's so much concern about female sexuality and female orgasm that they basically do what we call female genital cutting, which is when the labia are cut off, and often the clitoris is removed as well. And then everything is sort of sewn shut so that there's only one hole out of which the woman can urinate and out of which her menstrual fluids can come. The idea here is that if you remove the sexually pleasurable parts of the female body, then she won't be uncontrollably sexual, and in fact she won't enjoy sex at all, so she'll be very easily controlled. One of the more horrific parts of female genital cutting is that it's typically undone the night of the wedding via cutting. So it's a horrific thing both times it's done, and it's something that has become outlawed in a lot of the countries that practice it, and is, for instance, outlawed in America. The final thing for us to consider in regard to female sexual bodies is what women think they need to look like in order to be considered sexual. And of course this has always been a problem. Women have always been convinced that in some way they weren't attractive enough, but it has really been heightened by our recent use of the internet, and especially Photoshop, and especially social media. So one of the first places that we start to think about what women are supposed to look like is in ads. So basically, Photoshop has changed the way that we think about the human body. We tend to forget that the pictures that we're looking at are not the way that those women looked even when the picture itself was taken. So basically, we think that people are supposed to look like the final Photoshopped version of themselves. And this is really an impossible standard. You'll have to edit every single photograph you take, and that is just too big of a burden, especially to put on young women. So the way that we think female bodies are supposed to look is often very heavily manipulated. But when you're very young, you might not realize that. And this is true for both very young women and very young men. So for very young women who are looking at bodies like this, they may be convinced that they are supposed to look like the final edited version. And for very young men who are looking at bodies like this, they may become convinced that that's what women look like. So the lasting effects of thinking that we are supposed to look a certain way can be very damaging. Or what about the expectations contained in pornography? If we think about the way that women's bodies look in pornography, you can understand that that might not be the way they look in real life. The majority of women who are acting in porn have had plastic surgery done, usually breast enhancements. They've had most of their body hair removed, they're probably artificially tanned, they've probably changed their hair and their teeth and there's heavy makeup. All of that is not necessarily wrong by any means, but it doesn't mean that they look like other women are going to look. There's also the aspect of how often they're faking their orgasms. You might have certain expectations about how orgasmic female bodies are if in every porn you've seen, the women are orgasming instantly and continuously. So basically the way that we show people bodies are supposed to look has been heavily influenced by the amount of editing that we're able to do and by the amount of acting that we ask women to do. So our final question of the day is essentially how big of a problem this really is. One of the things that I'd like for you to consider as you go through your week is how prevalent is the sexualization of female bodies. Are the ads that you look like sexualized? Are the products that you buy containing pictures of women who have been sexualized? Were you yourself sexualized, perhaps even already today? This is one of those things that sometimes we think is not a big deal, and then sometimes the more we dig into it, realize is a big deal. So if you're concerned about the sexualization of women, ask the women in your life how they feel about it. You may be surprised by the answers you get. So, as always, if you have any questions about this week's lecture, please send me an email, and I'll see you next week when we'll talk about male bodies.